The moment the police sirens echoed through our quiet neighborhood, I knew something was terribly wrong. My wife stood frozen on our front porch, hands calm at her sides, while an HOA Karen pointed at her like she'd just exposed a criminal mastermind. What that woman didn't know, what she couldn't possibly imagine, was that my wife wasn't the one about to be humiliated. She was. It started as a peaceful Saturday morning. Sunlight spilled across trimmed lawns, sprinklers clicked rhythmically, and kids rode bikes without a care. My wife, dressed simply, was helping our daughter chalk the driveway when a sharp voice cut through the calm. The HOA president stormed over, clipboard clutched like a weapon, eyes burning with authority she desperately wanted respected. She accused my wife of unauthorized presence. Said she didn't recognize her. Said residents had complained. The irony was almost funny. My wife politely explained she lived here. That answer only fueled the fire. Karen demanded identification, invoked HOA bylaws, and announced she was calling 911 to have my wife removed for trespassing. Neighbors peeked through blinds. Phones came out. My wife remained calm, too calm. I recognized that expression. It was the same one she wore before stepping into command rooms full of high-ranking officers. But here, surrounded by hedges and judgment, she said nothing. She simply waited. When the patrol cars arrived, Karen smirked like victory was already hers. She rushed forward, loudly explaining how this suspicious woman refused to comply and threatened neighborhood safety. The officers turned to my wife, ready to follow procedure until she quietly spoke their names. Everything changed in seconds. Radios crackled. Postures stiffened. One officer swallowed hard. Karen's confidence evaporated as confusion rippled across her face. She didn't understand why the officers suddenly stood straighter. She didn't understand why one of them addressed my wife with unmistakable respect. And she definitely didn't understand the words that followed. "Ma'am, we didn't realize you were on site." Because the woman she tried to have arrested wasn't just a resident. She commanded the entire state police. The silence that followed felt heavier than the sirens that had brought everyone outside. Karen's mouth opened slightly, then closed, like her brain was scrambling to catch up with reality. The officers shifted their weight, suddenly aware they were standing in front of someone far above their pay grade, even if she looked like any other mom on the block. My wife didn't raise her voice. She didn't flash a badge or make a dramatic announcement. She simply asked, calmly, who had called 911 and why. The question landed like a hammer. One officer slowly turned toward Karen, who was now gripping her clipboard so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Karen launched into another explanation, louder this time, insisting she was just enforcing the rules and protecting property values. She claimed my wife was uncooperative, hostile, and refused to identify herself. Each accusation sounded weaker than the last. The neighbors, who moments ago had been whispering in agreement, now watched in awkward silence. My wife finally spoke again. She explained she was the homeowner, that she had complied fully, and that no law had been broken. Her tone was professional, controlled, unmistakably authoritative. One of the officers nodded repeatedly, clearly embarrassed. Another quietly apologized for the misunderstanding. Karen interrupted, demanding that the officers do their job and remove my wife anyway. That's when the senior officer asked Karen for her identification. The shift was instant. Karen blinked, stammered, and fumbled through her oversized purse. The power dynamic had flipped completely, and everyone could feel it. The officer explained that filing a false or exaggerated emergency call was a serious matter. HOA disputes, he said, were not criminal emergencies. Karen's face flushed red as she tried to backpedal, claiming she was concerned and felt threatened. No one believed her anymore. My wife stood quietly beside me now, her presence steady, almost protective. She didn't need to say who she was. The officers already knew. Word had traveled fast through their radios. Respect followed. Karen, meanwhile, shrank with every passing second. One neighbor finally spoke up, admitting Karen had been harassing residents for months. Another nodded in agreement. A third recorded everything on their phone. Karen realized she was no longer the voice of authority she thought she was. She was just a woman who'd gone too far. The officer issued Karen a warning and reminded her that misuse of emergency services could lead to serious consequences. As the patrol cars prepared to leave, Karen stood frozen, surrounded by the very people she once controlled. And then my wife turned to her and spoke one final sentence, quiet, firm, unforgettable. My wife looked Karen straight in the eyes and said, "Next time you have a concern, speak to people with respect before dialing 911. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't an insult. Somehow, that made it far more devastating." Karen nodded stiffly, pretending to accept the advice, but the damage was already done. The patrol cars rolled away, leaving behind an uncomfortable stillness. Neighbors lingered, unsure whether to disperse or stay and watch the fallout. Karen cleared her throat, straightened her blazer, and tried to reclaim control. She announced that the matter was resolved and everyone should return to their homes. No one moved. Someone laughed. Quietly at first, then louder. Another neighbor shook their head and walked back inside without acknowledging Karen at all. The authority she'd spent years cultivating dissolved in minutes. She turned to my wife again, this time forcing a smile, and suggested they start over on better terms. My wife declined politely. She said she believed in community, fairness, and accountability but not intimidation. Karen's smile twitched. She muttered something about bylaws and retreated toward her house, heels clicking sharply against the pavement. The clipboard that once symbolized power now looked ridiculous dangling at her side. Over the next few days, the story spread far beyond our street. HOA meetings buzzed with whispers. Screenshots of the video circulated in neighborhood group chats. People who'd been afraid to speak up suddenly found their voices. Complaints about selective enforcement, harassment, and abuse of authority poured in. Karen tried damage control. She sent emails framing the incident as a misunderstanding. She claimed she'd acted in good faith. But credibility, once lost, is hard to regain. Residents requested an emergency HOA meeting. Attendance broke records. My wife sat quietly in the back, unnoticed by some, recognized by others. When Karen took the floor, her confidence was gone. She spoke defensively, avoiding eye contact, stumbling over explanations. Then residents stood one by one, sharing stories they'd kept bottled up for years. Fines issued unfairly. Threats over trivial issues. Calls to police meant to intimidate, not protect. The room shifted. Votes were called. An investigation was requested. Karen's reign ended not with shouting, but with procedure, the very thing she'd abused. She resigned before the meeting ended, citing personal reasons. No one tried to stop her. As we walked home that night, my wife squeezed my hand. She hadn't planned to reveal anything. She hadn't wanted power to speak for her. But sometimes, standing your ground changes more than just one moment. And that moment was only the beginning. The morning after Karen resigned, the neighborhood felt different, like a storm had passed and left the air clearer. People waved more. Conversations lasted longer. Doors that once closed quickly now stayed open. It amazed me how fast fear disappeared once the source was gone. My wife noticed it too, though she said little. She prefers observation over celebration. Emails from the HOA board began arriving almost immediately. Temporary leadership was announced. Fines were suspended pending review. Rules would be re-evaluated for fairness. It sounded official, but beneath the polite language was a quiet admission, things had gone wrong for a long time. Karen hadn't just been strict. She'd been unchecked. Neighbors started stopping us during walks. Some thanked my wife directly. Others thanked us without fully knowing why, only that something had shifted. One elderly man admitted he'd paid hundreds in fines he never should have received. A young couple said they'd almost sold their house because of constant threats. Each story added weight to what had happened. Karen, meanwhile, vanished. Her house stayed dark. Her car didn't move. Rumors flew, lawsuits, investigations, embarrassment, but none of it mattered much anymore. What mattered was that people felt safe speaking again. My wife never commented on Karen directly. She said accountability didn't require revenge. A week later, a letter arrived requesting my wife's presence at a community forum, not as an officer, but as a resident. They wanted guidance on how to prevent abuse of authority in the future. She agreed, reluctantly. She didn't want recognition. She wanted change that lasted after attention faded. The forum filled the community center. Chairs ran out. People stood along the walls. My wife spoke calmly, explaining the difference between rules and power, enforcement and intimidation. She reminded them that authority only works when it's trusted. When fear replaces trust, everyone loses. Questions followed. Hard ones. Emotional ones. She answered honestly, never revealing her position, never pulling rank. That restraint impressed people more than titles ever could. By the end, applause filled the room, not loud, not dramatic, but sincere. Walking home, my wife admitted something she rarely does. She said moments like these were harder than commanding officers or managing crises. Because here, the stakes were personal. These weren't uniforms. These were neighbors. Families. Kids drawing chalk on driveways. That night, as lights dimmed across the street, I realized Karen hadn't just misjudged my wife's authority. She'd underestimated the power of quiet strength backed by integrity. And once people see that, they don't forget it easily. Just when life began settling into a new rhythm, another twist arrived, quieter but no less revealing. A certified letter appeared in our mailbox, stamped with legal language and heavy intention. Karen was filing a formal complaint against the HOA and several residents, claiming defamation and emotional distress. The irony was almost impressive. The neighborhood buzzed again, though this time with resolve instead of fear. People shared the letter online, not mockingly, but transparently. Karen's words painted her as a victim of betrayal, conveniently ignoring months of documented harassment. What surprised everyone was how prepared the community had become. Receipts existed. Emails. Videos. Witnesses. My wife reviewed everything carefully. She reminded neighbors to stay factual, calm, and united. No gloating. No retaliation. Truth would be enough. Her experience showed. This wasn't her first encounter with someone mistaking authority for immunity. She understood systems, and more importantly, consequences. A mediation session was scheduled. Karen finally reappeared, no clipboard this time, no crowd behind her. She looked smaller, tired, defensive. The mediator asked her to explain why she'd called 911. Karen's answer rambled, shifting blame, contradicting earlier statements. It unraveled quickly. Then residents spoke. One by one. Calmly. Respectfully. The mediator listened, took notes, asked follow-up questions. Karen interrupted often, growing increasingly agitated. Each interruption hurt her case more. When my wife spoke, she didn't mention her rank. She spoke only as a homeowner describing a moment of unnecessary escalation that could have ended badly. That honesty carried weight. The mediation ended without resolution. Karen's claims were dismissed weeks later. The letter that followed was brief and definitive. No damages. No wrongdoing by residents. Case closed. Karen never appealed. She moved out shortly after, selling quietly, without farewell. The HOA implemented permanent changes. Oversight committees. Clear limits on enforcement. Mandatory conflict training. Transparency became policy, not suggestion. New leadership rotated regularly to prevent power concentrating again. The neighborhood didn't just recover. It evolved. One evening, watching kids play freely in the street, a neighbor asked my wife if she'd ever regret not revealing who she was sooner. She smiled softly and said respect earned without titles lasts longer. Power borrowed from fear always collapses. As the sun dipped behind rooftops, laughter replaced tension, and chalk drawings returned to driveways. The lesson lingered quietly in every conversation. Authority doesn't come from calling 911. It comes from knowing when not to. And though Karen was gone, what she left behind changed everything for the better. Months passed, and with distance came clarity. What had once felt like a shocking confrontation slowly transformed into a defining chapter of our community's identity. People no longer whispered about the incident, they referenced it openly, almost academically, as an example of what unchecked authority looks like and how quickly it can crumble when challenged by calm resolve. The HOA meetings became surprisingly healthy. Debates happened, but they were respectful. Disagreements no longer ended with threats or fines, but with votes and compromises. New volunteers stepped forward, people who'd never imagined themselves participating before. Fear had been the barrier. Once removed, engagement followed naturally. My wife returned fully to her demanding role, often leaving early, coming home late. To most of the neighborhood, she was simply the woman who stayed composed when everything could have exploded. Few knew the full scope of her responsibilities. Fewer still needed to. Her influence had already done its work here. One afternoon, a police cruiser stopped by not for trouble, but for courtesy. Two officers knocked to thank my wife privately. They admitted the call had become a training example within their department. Not as a mistake, but as a reminder, context matters. Authority should be questioned respectfully, not blindly obeyed or misused. That conversation stayed with me. Karen hadn't just tried to remove my wife. She'd tried to weaponize systems meant to protect people. The real danger wasn't her attitude, it was how easily those systems could have been misdirected without resistance. Later that week, a new family moved in across the street. They'd heard nothing of the past drama. To them, this was just a friendly neighborhood with smiling faces and open sidewalks. Watching them settle in felt like proof of success. The best outcome wasn't revenge or headlines. It was normalcy restored. My wife and I talked about it one night, sitting on the porch where everything had started. She said leadership isn't about being known. It's about impact you don't have to explain. Karen wanted recognition, validation, control. My wife wanted safety, dignity, and balance. Only one of those lasts. The chalk drawings faded with rain, then reappeared brighter. Block parties returned. Trust rebuilt itself brick by brick. No one called 911 over bylaws again. People talked first. Listened second. Acted last. Sometimes power announces itself loudly. Other times, it waits, steady and silent, until it's needed. Karen never understood that difference. She thought volume equaled authority. She was wrong. And in that realization, our neighborhood found something stronger than rules. It found perspective. A year after the incident, the neighborhood anniversary picnic arrived almost unnoticed, yet it carried quiet significance. Folding tables lined the park, children chased balloons, and neighbors who once avoided eye contact now shared food and stories. It felt less like a celebration and more like a checkpoint, a moment to see how far things had come. Someone inevitably brought up that day, not with drama, but reflection. It had become shorthand for a lesson learned. New residents listened carefully as older ones explained how quickly power can distort when no one questions it. My wife listened too, saying nothing, letting others own the narrative. That restraint was intentional. She never wanted the story to belong to her alone. The temporary HOA leadership had evolved into something stable and fair. Rotating roles prevented anyone from sitting too comfortably. Transparency reports were posted publicly. Even disagreements felt safer now, because no one feared retaliation. The system had matured because people remained vigilant, not angry. Later that evening, a young neighbor approached my wife privately. She admitted she'd once dreamed of being a police officer but hesitated because of how authority could be perceived. My wife told her leadership isn't about image, it's about ethics under pressure. She said the badge doesn't make the person makes the badge. The young woman nodded, visibly relieved. I realized then that the ripple effects were still spreading. Karen's mistake had become a teaching moment not just for a block, but for individuals shaping their futures. That was something Karen never intended and never controlled. As dusk settled, the picnic wound down. Families packed leftovers. Laughter softened into contented quiet. My wife and I walked home along the same path where patrol cars once parked. No sirens. No clipboards. Just street lights and conversation drifting from open windows. At home, she paused before unlocking the door and said something that stuck with me. She said true authority doesn't need to prove itself in small moments. It shows up when restraint is harder than reaction. Karen had chosen reaction every time. My wife had chosen restraint. The difference reshaped everything. Weeks later, an anonymous letter arrived in the HOA mailbox, thanking the resident who showed us how power should look. My wife never claimed it. She said communities don't need heroes. They need standards. The neighborhood continued forward, not perfect, but aware. And awareness, once earned, doesn't fade easily. Karen's name became a footnote. The lesson became permanent. Time has a way of smoothing sharp memories, but it also clarifies what truly mattered. By the second year, the incident had settled into local lore, retold less for shock and more for guidance. It wasn't about Karen anymore. It was about what happens when ordinary people refuse to be intimidated and choose composure instead. The HOA continued improving, but what stood out most was how neighbors handled conflict themselves. Disputes over noise, parking, or pets were addressed face to face. Conversations replaced complaint forms. Even when tensions rose, people remembered how quickly things once spiraled and how unnecessary it had been. That memory acted like a brake, slowing reactions before they became disasters. My wife noticed changes beyond the neighborhood. At work, she saw officers referencing the story during briefings, not by name or location, but by principle. Don't assume. De-escalate first. Authority carries responsibility long before it carries power. She never corrected them. She didn't need credit. The idea mattered more than the source. One afternoon, a delivery driver mistakenly blocked a driveway, triggering a heated exchange between two residents. Before voices rose too high, someone calmly stepped in and said, "Let's not make this a Karen moment." The tension broke instantly. Laughter followed. Perspective returned. A problem dissolved that once would have exploded. That was when I realized the story had evolved into a cultural reference, a shorthand reminder of restraint. Not mocking. Not cruel. Just grounding. Karen's attempt to control had ironically produced the opposite, collective self-awareness. My wife and I spent more evenings outside, talking with neighbors who once stayed hidden. People shared aspirations, worries, small victories. Community isn't built by rules alone. It's built by trust repeated over time. The incident had accelerated something that might have taken decades otherwise. Occasionally, someone asked what Karen was doing now. We never knew. And eventually, no one asked anymore. Her absence wasn't a victory, it was a resolution. The story didn't need an antagonist to continue teaching its lesson. On a quiet night, my wife admitted something unexpected. She said she'd worried that day not about arrest, but about escalation. About how easily pride can push people into irreversible mistakes. That fear, she said, was why she stayed calm. Panic feeds panic. Calm starves it. Standing on the porch, listening to crickets and distant laughter, I understood. Karen had believed power meant control over others. My wife knew power meant control over oneself. That distinction changed everything. And as the neighborhood slept peacefully, it was clear the greatest impact wasn't what happened that day but what never happened again. The final lesson didn't arrive with sirens, meetings, or letters. It arrived quietly, years later, in the way the neighborhood simply functioned. New families moved in without inheriting old fears. Children grew up unaware there had ever been a time when calling the police over chalk drawings felt normal. Peace became routine, not remarkable. Sometimes I think about how close everything came to going wrong that first day. How easily anger could have escalated. How quickly systems designed for safety could have been turned into weapons. Karen believed she was protecting order, but what she truly defended was her own sense of control. When that illusion cracked, everything else followed. My wife never spoke about that day publicly. She didn't include it in speeches or training manuals. Yet its influence lingered everywhere in how officers handled calls, how neighbors handled disputes, how people paused before reacting. That kind of impact doesn't need documentation. It lives in behavior. One evening, long after the story stopped circulating, I asked my wife if she'd do anything differently. She thought for a moment, then shook her head. She said the goal was never to win. It was to prevent harm. Winning feeds ego. Prevention protects people. Karen wanted a victory. My wife wanted everyone to go home safely. That difference defines leadership more than any title ever could. The porch where it all began became just a porch again. No memory plagues. No reminders. Just a place to sit, talk, and watch the street lights come on. And somehow, that felt right. Moments that matter most don't need monuments. They need understanding. Every so often, I notice someone pause during an argument, take a breath, and lower their voice. I see people choose conversation over confrontation. I see restraint where fear once lived. And I know that one misguided 911 call reshaped far more than a single afternoon. Karen faded into anonymity, exactly where unchecked authority always ends. Not remembered for power, but for the lesson left behind. Meanwhile, my wife returned to what she always did, leading quietly, decisively, without spectacle. The neighborhood didn't need to know who she was. They only needed to know who they wanted to be. If there's a takeaway from all of this, it's simple. Power doesn't come from shouting, calling, or commanding. It comes from restraint, clarity, and respect, especially when you think you're entitled to more. That day could have ended in humiliation, arrest, or violence. Instead, it ended in awareness. And awareness, once earned, protects far longer than authority ever can. The sirens never returned. And that was the real victory.